Juliet was, to describe her in the simplest way, dazzling. Not only physically, although she definitely was, but because of her personality. She seemed like the perfect combination of confidence and warmth. We met at a work event, we were both bored with the endless chatter and ended up sharing a light conversation in the furthest corner of the room. We talked about everything and nothing, music, travel, and how absurdly expensive martinis were. Her laugh was contagious. And by the time the night ended, I couldn't stop thinking about her. From there, everything moved quickly. We texted every day, had incredible dates, and within months it seemed like we were inseparable. It was my first truly serious relationship. And although I had some friends who warned me that perhaps we were moving too fast, I was convinced that Juliet was the one. A year later, I proposed. I planned everything meticulously, a dinner at her favorite restaurant, background music with her favorite song, and a ring that cost me everything I had saved for months. She cried when she said yes, and I thought I was the luckiest man in the world. But honestly, that's where the problem started. Although I was too blind to realize it. Juliet was a perfectionist. But not in the sense that she strove to improve herself, but that she expected everyone around her to be perfect to meet her standards. This was especially noticeable during the wedding planning. Nothing I did seemed to be enough. I chose flowers, and she changed them for more elegant ones. I chose the menu, and she told me that I should splurge a bit more because it was a once-in-a-lifetime day. Despite the comments, I let it all happen because I thought it was normal. After all, the wedding had to be special. My parents, who had always been incredibly close to me, also got very involved in the planning. They loved Juliet. Or at least it seemed that way. My mother, in particular, became deeply fond of her. She didn't have any sisters and had always wanted to have a close relationship with my future wife. Juliet took full advantage of this. She became her confidant. Someone with whom my mother spoke almost daily. Many times more than she spoke with me. The wedding was grand. One of those that people talk about for months. But it was also a financial hole for me. I covered about 80% of the costs with a little help from my parents. Juliet, who was still paying off her student loans, couldn't contribute much. And although she said she felt bad about it, she didn't seem to have a problem always choosing the most expensive options. However, at that time, I didn't care. I was happy to have married the woman I loved. It was after the wedding when things started to change more obviously. At first, they were small comments. Things like, "Why can't you earn more money like my cousin Hugo?" Or, "We should move to a better place. This apartment no longer reflects who we are as a couple." She also stopped dwelling in the small moments we used to enjoy together. Pizza and movie nights were replaced by events with her group of friends from college, where I felt like an outsider. The most painful thing, however, was when Juliet started using my own parents against me. She would complain to them about the smallest things, that I worked too much, that I didn't make enough effort to pamper her, or even that I didn't dress well enough. My parents, especially my mother, started asking me if I was doing everything I could to be a good husband. My mother mentioned one day something Juliet had said. That I had changed since we got married. That I was no longer so attentive. That hurt because I felt that I was doing everything possible to keep her happy. Then came the issue of money. Juliet decided to quit her job. She argued that they wanted to refocus their lives and that it would be better for our relationship if she spent more time at home. The worst part was that my parents supported this decision, saying that it was my responsibility as a husband to provide for her. I tried to resist, but ended up accepting, believing that maybe this would make things better. It didn't. At first, I thought Juliet would really dedicate herself to some project or hobby. But in reality, she spent most of her time going out with friends, buying unnecessary things, or simply staying home watching television. Meanwhile, I was working overtime to cover our bills. When I mentioned how unfair this was, she simply looked at me with disdain and said, "That's what men who truly love their wives do." One day, arriving home early, I overheard a conversation between Juliet and my mother, which today left me frozen. Juliet was telling my mother that I was probably having an affair because I had been coming home late lately and no longer seemed interested in her. My mother, instead of defending me, seemed to believe her. That night, when I confronted Juliet, she looked at me coldly and said, "Well, if you don't want people to think that, maybe you should act like a real husband." After that night, the relationship with Juliet continued to deteriorate. Each day felt heavier, tenser, and although I tried to do my part to improve things, it seemed like she had no interest in doing so. Any effort I made was met with indifference or, worse, with criticism. But the most frustrating thing was not just how Juliet treated me, but how she continued to manipulate my parents against me. Juliet and my mother spoke every day, and my mother seemed more convinced with each conversation that I was the problem in our marriage. It was as if they were forming a team, and I was the enemy. My father, although less vocal at first, also began to look at me with a certain air of disapproval every time I tried to explain my perspective or talk about the problems we were facing. Juliet and my parents looked at me as if I were being selfish or insensitive. The manipulation reached a critical point when Juliet dropped a bomb. She wanted us to buy a house. According to her, our small apartment was no longer enough for the life we deserved. I knew that financially this was nonsense. I was barely managing to cover our current expenses. Much less could we afford a mortgage. But Juliet was not interested in listening to reasons. She insisted that it was the best for us. And when I refused, she went straight to my parents. I don't know exactly how she managed to get them on her side so quickly, but within days I received a call from my mother. Her tone was full of disapproval, as if she were talking to a small child who had made a mistake. She told me that Juliet was right, that we needed a house, and that it was time for me to think more about my family. When I tried to explain that we couldn't afford it, she interrupted me and said that if I wasn't willing to make sacrifices for my marriage, then maybe I wasn't taking it as seriously as I should. Those comments hurt me deeply. Here I was working overtime, paying for practically everything while Juliet did nothing but spend money and complain. And yet my parents thought I wasn't doing enough. But the worst was yet to come. One night, I came home early after a long day of work. I was exhausted both physically and mentally, and the only thing I wanted was to rest. However, upon entering the apartment, I noticed something strange. Juliet was sitting on the couch talking on the phone. And although at first I didn't pay attention, something in her tone caught my attention. It seemed different, as if she were flirting. When she saw me enter, she hung up hastily and gave me a look that I couldn't decipher. I didn't want to make a scene, but that feeling that something was wrong wouldn't leave me. So, that same night, while Juliet was sleeping, I checked her phone. What I found left me frozen. There were messages from a man named Thomas. Someone who clearly wasn't just a friend. The messages were blatant, full of innuendos and jokes that crossed all the boundaries of what I would consider acceptable in a marriage. But the worst thing was reading how Juliet complained about me with him, saying things like, "James is so boring. He only knows how to work and talk about responsibilities. I wish I could be with you instead of having to endure this." I was paralyzed. For months, I had been enduring her criticism, her demands, and her indifference, thinking that maybe I was the problem, that maybe I wasn't doing enough. But there was the truth, raw and heartbreaking. Juliet was not only not interested in fixing our marriage, but she was actively seeking comfort in someone else while despising me behind my back. The next morning, I confronted her, showed her the messages, and demanded an explanation. Instead of apologizing or showing any remorse, she looked at me coldly and said, "And what did you expect? You're never here. And when you are, you only talk about money and problems. I needed someone to make me feel alive." Those words hit me like a brick. At that moment, I knew that our marriage was broken, that there was no way to save it. But what infuriated me even more was what came next. Juliet, with total impudence, told me that she wasn't going anywhere, that this was her home as much as mine, and that if I wasn't willing to accept our situation, then I should be the one to leave. I decided not to say anything at the moment. I knew that arguing with her would not lead me anywhere. So, I started to plan my exit. I spoke with a lawyer to initiate the divorce process and began to look for a place where I could stay temporarily. But in the meantime, Juliet wasted no time. Not only did she continue to see Thomas, but she also began to tell my parents a completely distorted version of what was happening. According to her, I was emotionally neglecting her and drifting away from my marriage. She even insinuated that I was the one having an affair. When my parents confronted me about this, I was speechless. I showed them the evidence I had of her infidelity. But my mother, in a turn I never expected, told me, "This doesn't prove anything. James, maybe if you were a better husband, Juliet wouldn't need to seek comfort elsewhere." With the decision made, I began to move the pieces to get out of that nightmare. It wasn't easy. The divorce was not just a legal process, it was an emotional fight against someone who seemed determined to ruin me. But what really surprised me was how quickly Juliet changed her strategy. Once she realized that I was not willing to stay trapped in that cycle. The first sign that things were going to get worse was a call from my mother. Just a few days after I spoke with the lawyer. She was crying. Something unusual for a woman who had always been strong and relentless. "How can you do this to Juliet?" she asked me between sobs. Confused, I asked her what she was talking about. And that's when I found out. Juliet had gone to my parents' house with her bags packed, saying that I had kicked her out of the apartment. She told an elaborate story about how I had betrayed her, how I had started to act cold and distant for months, and how I had finally told her that I no longer loved her. According to her, I was involved with a co-worker, a non-existent woman who conveniently fit with the comments that Juliet had sown in the past about my supposed late arrivals and secret messages. My mother, being the gullible person she was when it came to Juliet, believed her without question. My father, although more reserved, also seemed to lean towards her version of the events. It was as if all the evidence I had against Juliet didn't matter. What did matter was the perfect image she had built of herself in front of them for years. When I tried to defend myself, my mother cut me off with a phrase that still echoes in my head: "James, I've always thought you were better than this. I don't know what happened to you." That night, I felt completely alone. My own family, the people who should have been on my side, had turned their backs on me. With everything that was happening, I decided to speed up the divorce process. My lawyer was incredibly competent, and together we began to gather evidence of everything Juliet had done. We had the messages with Thomas, the records of unjustified expenses that she had made in my name, and the statements of some friends who knew about her erratic and manipulative behavior. It seemed that, at least in court, things were going to lean in my favor. However, Juliet was not going to let things be so easy. A week before our first hearing, I received a formal notification that she was requesting spousal support. According to her argument, she had quit her job at my request, and now she had no way to support herself. It was a desperate tactic to continue squeezing me. It was frustrating, but I wasn't surprised at all. Meanwhile, Juliet continued to manipulate my parents. The situation became unbearable when my mother started sending money directly to her, claiming that it wasn't fair that she was going through this alone. When I discovered this, I was furious. Not only was I being attacked legally by my own wife, but now my parents were financing her efforts. When I confronted my mother, she accused me of being cruel and heartless. "I don't know what you've become, but it's not the son we raised," she said. The day of the first hearing finally arrived, and Juliet tried to maintain her impeccable image in court. She gave a prepared speech, crying while talking about how I had ruined her life and left her with nothing. But my lawyer, who had done an impeccable job, presented the evidence of her infidelity and the messages in which she clearly admitted that she was using our relationship for her financial benefit. The judge did not take long to decide. Juliet's case quickly fell apart. And not only was her request for spousal support dismissed, But I also had the right to recover a part of the expenses that she had unjustifiably accumulated in my name. It was a small victory in the midst of all the chaos. But I couldn't feel completely relieved. The battle with my parents was still far from over. The situation with them reached a new level of toxicity when Juliet, just a month after the divorce was finalized, announced on social media her engagement to Thomas. For me, it was a hard blow. But what really devastated me was finding out that my parents had publicly congratulated Juliet on her new happiness. They even attended her engagement party. Something I discovered through photos that a friend of mine sent me. When I confronted my mother about this, she simply said, "Juliet will always be like a daughter to us. We can't just abandon her because you decided to get a divorce." It was then that I knew there was nothing I could do to repair the relationship with my parents while they continued to blindly support Juliet. Little by little, I began to distance myself from them. It was not an easy decision, but every interaction with them made me feel more isolated and devalued. Despite everything, I began to rebuild my life. I moved to another city, far from all the painful memories, and found a job that offered me not only economic stability but also the opportunity to start over. However, the impact of everything that had happened still haunted me. Even when I was starting to find some peace, I knew that Juliet was still in contact with my parents. From time to time, I received calls or messages from them trying to convince me to make peace with Juliet, as if everything she had done didn't matter. It was exhausting. I thought things couldn't get worse. But as always, Juliet had an ace up her sleeve. I was just starting to feel like I could breathe again when Juliet decided to launch her final attack. It was as if she had been waiting for the perfect moment to strike another blow. And she did it with surgical precision. It all started with a message from my mother. It was nothing out of the ordinary at first. It just said, "James, we need to talk. It's important." I hesitated to respond. But eventually I did, thinking that maybe there was a glimmer of hope in our relationship. When I called her, my mother wasted no time in getting to the point. "Juliet needs your help," she said. I remained silent, trying to understand if I had heard correctly. Help her? After everything she had done? My mother continued as if what she was asking was perfectly reasonable. "She's going through a difficult time. Thomas left her, and she's having trouble finding a place to stay. We can't help her financially right now, but we thought it would be the right thing for you to offer her some support." I felt the anger rising in my chest. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. I reminded my mother in a tense voice everything that Juliet had put me through, the infidelity, the manipulation, the attempt to ruin me financially. But my mother, in her infinite stubbornness, simply replied, "She made mistakes too, James. But we all deserve a second chance." That call marked a point of no return for me. I cut the conversation and decided that I could no longer keep trying to maintain a relationship with my parents while they insisted on idolizing Juliet. It was painful, but I blocked their numbers and made sure that no common friends told me anything about them. In the following weeks, Juliet continued her campaign to paint me as the villain. She told my friends and common acquaintances that I had abandoned her emotionally and financially, that I had left her in the street, and that I was incapable of taking responsibility for my own mistakes. At first, I tried to ignore it. But when some of those friends started confronting me directly, I decided to defend myself. I showed them the evidence I had gathered during the divorce, the messages with Thomas, the expenses she had made without consulting me, and the legal records that showed that she had tried to manipulate the system in her favor. It was a relief to see that little by little, more people were starting to realize who Juliet really was. But it wasn't enough to erase the damage she had already done. During this time, I discovered something I didn't expect: freedom. Without the constant pressure of Juliet and without the judgment of my parents, I began to focus on myself for the first time in years. I immersed myself in my work, started going to the gym, and explored hobbies that I had set aside during my marriage. I even dared to date someone, although at first I was cautious. That's how I met Claire, a woman completely different from Juliet in every way. She was kind, sincere, and had an energy that made anything seem possible. We met in a hiking group, and from the first moment I felt at ease with her. There were no games or manipulations. Just genuine conversations and a connection that grew over time. But just when I thought I was finally emerging from Juliet's shadow, she reappeared, determined to ruin my new life. It all started when Claire posted a photo of us on Instagram. It was something innocent. A picture of us on a hike, smiling by a lake. However, that photo reached the wrong eyes. Juliet, in a move that shouldn't have surprised me, contacted Claire directly. She sent her a private message full of lies, telling her that I had been an abusive husband, that I had cheated on her for years, and that she only wanted to warn her so she wouldn't fall into my clutches. Claire, being the straightforward person she is, showed me the messages instantly. Instead of getting angry, I felt deep sadness. Here was this woman who had already destroyed so much in my life, trying to poison what little I had managed to rebuild. I explained the whole situation to Claire, from the beginning, with brutal honesty. I showed her the same evidence that I had shared with my friends. And to my relief, she not only believed me, but also decided to ignore Juliet completely. But Juliet didn't stop there. She managed to contact my parents and convince them that Claire was a bad influence on my life. Shortly after, I received an email from my mother, full of absurd accusations, saying that Claire was trying to isolate me from my family and that she was probably with me only for money. It was the last straw. I responded briefly and forcefully, making it clear to them that my relationship with them was completely broken and that I would not allow them to interfere in my life again. After that email, I made a decision that I had been postponing for some time: change my phone number, close my social media accounts, and cut off any ties with the people who were still in contact with Juliet. I needed to protect my peace, and I was willing to do whatever it took to achieve it. Over time, Claire and I continued to strengthen our relationship. She was an invaluable support as I tried to heal the wounds that Juliet and my parents had left on me. Little by little, I began to feel that I could trust someone again. And that was an invaluable gift. However, Juliet had not finished playing her last cards. A few months after I had closed any channels of contact with my parents and completely blocked Juliet out of my life, I thought the worst was behind me. My relationship with Claire was going great. I had gotten a promotion at my job. And for the first time in years, I felt like I was in control of my destiny. But, as seemed to be the constant in this saga, Juliet had a special talent for finding ways to complicate my life. One afternoon, I received an unexpected email from an unknown sender. When I opened it, I was frozen. It was from a lawyer who was representing Juliet. The email stated that Juliet was considering filing a defamation lawsuit against me. According to her argument, I had destroyed her reputation by inventing lies about her during the divorce process, which, according to her, had cost her job opportunities and had caused her significant emotional damage. My first reaction was one of disbelief. How could Juliet have the audacity to try this after everything she had done? I immediately contacted my lawyer, who, after reviewing the documentation, seemed calm. "This has no merit," he assured me. "It's just an attempt to intimidate you. She can't sue you for telling the truth, especially when you've already presented evidence of her behavior in court." Despite those words, the stress returned like a wave. Even knowing that the case had no merit, the mere idea of having to deal with Juliet again filled me with anxiety. But what worried me the most was how this would affect Claire. She had already endured more than her share due to my past, and I didn't want this new attack to discourage her. I decided to be completely honest with her. That night, while we were having dinner, I told her about the lawyer's email and what it implied. To my surprise, she reacted with impressive calmness. She took my hand and said, "I knew this woman wasn't going to give up easily. But you're not alone in this, James. We'll face it together." Her support gave me the strength I needed to move forward. My lawyer filed a formal response dismissing Juliet's accusations. And as expected, it wasn't long before she withdrew her threat of a lawsuit. It was a relief. But it also became clear to me that Juliet was desperate to maintain some kind of control over my life. The following weeks were relatively quiet until Claire and I decided to take an important step: move in together. We had found a small but cozy apartment in a quiet area. Perfect to start this new stage. However, just as we were finishing unpacking the boxes, I received another piece of news that I didn't expect. An old mutual friend, someone who had cut off contact with Juliet but was still in contact with my mother, sent me a message. He warned me that Juliet was planning to attend an upcoming family event that my parents were organizing in a few weeks. The most worrying thing was that my parents not only knew that Juliet was going to attend, but apparently they were the ones who had invited her. I couldn't understand it. How could my parents continue to allow this woman to invade our lives after everything that had happened? I knew that I no longer had a relationship with them. But this gesture felt like a renewed betrayal. It took me a lot to decide what to do with this information. Part of me wanted to ignore it, move on, and not let any of this affect me. But another part knew that if I didn't say anything, I was letting Juliet continue to control the narrative. I finally decided to write a letter to my parents. It wasn't easy, but I felt that I needed to make my emotions clear and, more importantly, put an end to this story. In the letter, I detailed everything I had endured during my marriage with Juliet. How she had manipulated our family. And how, by continuing to support her, they were hurting me deeply. I made it clear to them that this would be my last communication with them unless they showed a significant change in their behavior. Sending that letter was like taking a weight off my shoulders. I knew that it probably wouldn't change anything, but at least I felt like I was regaining some of my power. A few days later, I received a response from my mother. It was brief and cold. "We regret that you feel this way, but we believe you are exaggerating. We will always consider Juliet part of our family." That was all I needed to read. I blocked their numbers again, deleted any trace of contact with them, and decided that for my own mental health, I wasn't going to look back. Today, as I write this, I am in a completely different place than I was a few years ago. Claire and I are engaged, and we are expecting our first child. My life is no longer defined by the shadows of the past, but by the hope and love I have found in this new stage. Juliet, from what I hear from other people, continues to live her life as always, jumping from one relationship to another and causing chaos wherever she goes. My parents, for their part, are still in contact with her, but I no longer care. I have accepted that I cannot change how they see things, but I can choose how to live my life.